You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Amy Jill Levine. She goes by AJ. She's a rabbi, Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University of Religion and Peace, and University Professor of same, Emerita. Well, let me take that out. That second part's I'm getting tongue-tied in there.
Why don't you start again and make it clear that I am not a rabbi, that rabbi is part of my title.
Oh, whoops. Okay, I apologize. All right, I'll start again. I have Amy Jill Levine. She goes by AJ. She's a Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University of Religion and Peace, and a University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, part of the Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita, and Professor of New Testament Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt. She has publications including The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, Short Stories by Jesus, The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi, 6 children's books with Sandy Sasso, many other publications included. So, AJ, thank you for coming.
Oh, I'm happy to talk with you.
Yeah. Well, if you would tell me a bit about your history, what got you interested in your current studies?
And you know what? I would think you would probably know that, because otherwise we would not be talking with each other. I am a Jew. I'm a member of an Orthodox synagogue, although I am not Orthodox in practice. And I happen to be an expert on the New Testament, and in particular on the Gospels and Jesus of Nazareth. And I got interested in this because I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody was Christian, and they were doing stuff in their worship settings that I was not doing in mine. And I was very curious about who this Jesus person was who seemed so important, and plus his mother, Mary. I lived in a Catholic neighborhood, so Mary was very important. And then a kid on the school bus said to me, "You killed our Lord." So, I was interested in this Jesus fellow and this Mary lady, and then I was interested in why I was being accused of murder. So that kind of got me started, and that was well over half a century ago.
Yeah, I thought, Jews focus on the Old Testament, so I guess that's why I asked you. It was kind of unusual. Seems like that you were studying the New Testament. But
Jews do not focus on the Old Testament. Jews focus on the Tanakh. And so the Old Testament's a Christian term because the stuff that Jews and Christians are reading, although we're all reading like Genesis and Isaiah and the Psalms, we're reading those texts in a different canonical order, which tells a different story, because where you end makes a huge amount of difference, with a completely different reception history. So in effect, the Old Testament is not the Tanakh, but that's another book.
Oh, if you wouldn't mind, just for a moment, I didn't know that. So I thought it was just a different name for the same thing, but you said the order is different. So, and the story comes out differently. Like, can you give me a few highlights on how it's different by reading it in the Tanakh order?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, we all start out with Genesis. The Old Testament, which is the Christian Bible Part 1, changes the order the first time by tucking the book of Ruth in between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel. Which is where it shows up chronologically, because Ruth is David's great grandmother. And so you need to have Ruth before you can have David. And the Jewish tradition sticks Ruth at the end with a collection called the Ketuvim, the writings. So Ruth shows up connected with books like, say, the book of Esther or the book of Proverbs that talks about the woman whose price is above rubies. And the major difference is the Jewish canon called the Tanakh for Torah instruction, sometimes a lot of the Pentateuch, Nevi'im, the prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings or the miscellaneous stuff. Jews to stick the prophets in the middle. So the prophetic books like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the book of the 12, that's in the middle. What the Christian canon does, the Old Testament, is it sticks the writings like Ruth or Esther in the middle, and it ends with the prophets. So the last book in the Old Testament is the prophet Malachi, and Malachi ends with a prediction of the coming of the prophet Elijah, as in Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, that Elijah, to come and proclaim the Messianic age, which means that the Old Testament, the Christian Bible Part 1, is a story of promise leading to fulfillment in the New Testament. So we have the promise of the coming of Elijah to announce the Messianic age. And then the New Testament pops in and gives you John the Baptist in the role of Elijah, and Jesus is the fulfillment of all those prophecies. The way I like to think about the canon of the church is kind of like football. There's a kickoff in the Garden of Eden, and then Christians will talk about something called the fall of man or the fall of humanity, where Adam and Eve royally screw up in Genesis chapter 3. And it's all kind of negative yardage until you get to the Gospels, the beginning of the New Testament. And then it's positive yardage up until the goalpost, which is the book of Revelation. So Christianity is football, and it's very linear. The Jewish canon tucks Malachi along with the other prophets in the middle. And the Jewish canon ends with a book called Second Chronicles, which is kind of like a cleaned up replay of First and Second Kings. Second Chronicles, and hence the Jewish canon, ends with the edict of King Cyrus of Persia, who has just conquered the kingdom of Babylon. And he says to the Jews in exile in Babylon, go home. The Lord has given me authority over all the nations of the world. Go home. What he's really doing historically is he wants a buffer in the Middle East, because the new kingdom on the block are the Macedonians, and that's going to be Alexander the Great. But for the Bible, it's go home, go back to your home country, go rebuild your temple, go resettle your land, which means that for Jews, the canon of the Tanakh is baseball. You leave home, you get stranded in second base, and then at the end, you go back home. So we're playing in effect on different fields with different rules, with different teams, with different outfits. And some of the things may look the same. I mean, they both have balls and they both have people running around and they both have managers, but they really are very, very different books, as football and baseball are very, very different games. So if we stop trying to make us read this as if like we're reading the same text, then we don't have to fight over the interpretation. We're both right. Jews interpret the text their way and Christians interpret the text their way.
What about archaeological dating of the various books of the Tanakh or the Old Testament? I know it's different.
Right.
Does the Jewish way corroborate more closely with archaeology or the Christian way, or is it too nebulous to tell?
It depends upon the book that you're looking at. The books are not written in chronological order. I mean, it would be nice. Like, let's start with creation and write down exactly what happened, as if somebody was there or if this actually really happened. Some of the prophets are earlier, some of the writings are later. So archaeologically, neither canonical order fully comports with what we've got, which means your question is a very good one, because it gives us three separate ways of understanding this text. We can understand it in its own historical context, and that's where archaeology is very helpful. Or we can understand it the way the Christian church interpreted it. And for the Christian church, pretty much the entire Old Testament points to Jesus. So that if you read that text through Christian lenses, you can find Jesus or the Trinity starting in the first page of Genesis and going all the way up to the last page of Malachi. Or you can read it through Jewish reception history, which means it kind of talks to itself and you keep going back to the beginning and rereading. So three different ways of understanding the text, all of which are legitimate, and none of these ways is complete.
So when you read it in the Tanakh order and then you contemplate the New Testament, how does it look different to you now with that different context?
Right, because if you begin with the New Testament and then you backtrack to the Old Testament, you're going to see a lot of Jesus that if you didn't know about Jesus, you would never see at all. So the book of Genesis begins, it's a temporal clause. When in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void. And then this thing called a ruach Elohim in Hebrew hovers over the face of the deep. Well, ruach means spirit, but it also means wind, and it also means breath. And Elohim can mean God, but it can also mean something like really mighty, as in the Old English term God awful. God awful. Today you say God awful, it sounds like something terrible. But in Middle English, God awful means so stupendous that only God can deal with it. It's God awful. So what we may have in that first verse is a mighty wind, a God awful wind, a great wind. But since we see references to the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, then we're inclined to talk about the Spirit of God. In the Gospel of John, which begins in the beginning, I mean, it literally begins in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, if you do that, and then you read back in Genesis, then you see Jesus as this incarnate Word already present in Genesis. So if I begin with the New Testament, I'm going to see the Holy Spirit and Jesus in the first couple of verses in Genesis. And if I begin through rabbinic commentary, I'm going to see a whole lot of other things, but not Jesus and not the Holy Spirit.
So from the Jewish perspective, again, what is observed differently from the Christian perspective when looking at the Old Testament? Or, sorry, the Tanakh.
Yeah, the Tanakh. Well, so there is no one Jewish perspective. That's that old joke about two Jews, three opinions, minimally. There is no singular Jewish reading. So whereas the Old Testament from the Christian perspective all points to Jesus, the Jewish readings don't point to anything in particular except to continue to engage in conversation. So that when you look at rabbinic literature at the beginning of Genesis or in any other passage, you find multiple interpretations. The rabbis, they have a saying, Shiva Panim LaTorah. The Torah has 70 faces, as if the Torah is this beautifully faceted, perfectly cut gem. And every time you turn it and it hits the light differently, you get a different message. The easiest way to see how this plays out is if we go to the prophet Isaiah, who in chapter 53 talks about the servant or slave, the Hebrew could be translated either way, who suffers, and seemingly vicariously because of Israel's sins or because of the sins of the nations. And if you look at Christian interpretation, the suffering servant is Jesus. Any way you look at him, he's Jesus. And if you look at the Jewish tradition over time, there are like 70 different possible interpretations of who that suffering servant is. So the major way that we see the difference is that the Old Testament for Christianity, it has a singular meaning. It points to Jesus. The Tanakh for Judaism has no singular meaning. It is whatever the community of readers or the individual reader takes from it at any particular time.
But are there predominant viewpoints that seem to be, more often than not?
Yeah, there is some majority, right? There are majority and minority views. So that the majority view on Isaiah's suffering servant, and this comes to us from medieval biblical commentators like Rashi, who's writing in France, who says, well, the suffering servant is Israel, and the people speaking are the Gentile nations, and the Gentile nations look at the suffering servant, the covenant community of Israel in exile in Babylon, the king dethroned and blinded, the temple burned down, the people in exile. Now, when somebody takes you into exile in the ancient world, basically you disappeared from history. And what happens, instead of disappearing from history, this little country of Judah, eventually to be called Judea, actually gets repatriated. People get to go back home. Thank you, Cyrus of Persia. And the nations say, oh, good grief. This God of Israel must be extraordinary that people who suffered so much and then got repatriated rather than got lost to history. And then they realized by looking at the fate of the Jews that there really is one God and it's Israel's God. So by the sufferings of Israel, the pagan nations are healed. And that becomes the dominant reading in the Jewish community. But others have suggested within the Jewish community that the suffering servant is Isaiah himself, or maybe Moses, or maybe Ezekiel. So various answers over time.
What are some of the Jewish views on the New Testament? Is it just like, don't bother looking at it, or, what are various perspectives on it?
Yeah, well, there are about as many perspectives as there are Jews. So there were some Jews who would never look at it, who consider it a hateful anti-Semitic work, and therefore why would they look at it? Most of the people who have that claim have probably never looked at it. When I was a child and I mentioned to one of my aunts that I was studying the New Testament, she said, why are you reading that hateful anti-Semitic book? And I said, have you ever read it? She said, no. Why would I read that hateful anti-Semitic book? I don't think ignorance helps anyone. And well, there are very problematic passages in there. I mean, you do kind of need a trigger warning to look at some of the New Testament passages. For me, the New Testament is a source of Jewish history. The only Pharisee from whom we have written records is Paul of Tarsus. The first person in literature ever identified by the title rabbi is Jesus of Nazareth. If I want to know about Jewish women in the first century in Galilee, the New Testament is my best source. Others, it's a source of heretical treatment, like a Judaism that got off track. And still others, it's a source of a Judaism that they don't necessarily follow. So the New Testament then would be comparable to, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls or the writings of Philo. So it depends upon the Jew that you ask, and it also depends upon the New Testament book that you're looking at.
Well, what has it given you? Like, why have you spent so much time and effort studying the New Testament? It must have given you something meaningful. What is it?
Oh, yeah. It does a couple of things. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, it's Jewish history. And it's stuff I never learned in Hebrew school. Hebrew school, we were great up to the books of the Maccabees, which are not in the Jewish canon either, by the way. So we got up to the Hanukkah story, which is in the 160s BCE. And then, like magic, suddenly we were in the Mishnah, which is the early 3rd century Common Era. So this is Jewish history that I didn't learn in the synagogue. And I thought, well, this is my history. The other thing is that the New Testament, the interpretation of the New Testament has been used to harm Jews for 2,000 years. It's been used to say that Jews are children of the devil, because that's a comment in the Gospel of John. It's been used to damn Jews as Christ killers. It's been used to say that Jews for all times and places are guilty of the death of Jesus. It's been used to say that Jews are lovers of money. That charge shows up against the Pharisees in the Gospel of Luke. So one thing that I can do as an historian is to try to take some of these very, very harmful, difficult passages, try to determine what they would have meant in their own historical context, and then provide, especially Christians who look at this text as sacred, some alternative ways of interpreting it other than ways that come out by proclaiming hatred of Jews. So I get to recover my own history. I get to make the text safer in the hands of Christians for Jews. I'm fascinated by the stories. I'm fascinated by the literature. One does not have to be a Christian to be fascinated by Christian texts any more than one has to be, French to be fascinated by Paris, or Chinese to be interested in Chinese calligraphy.
So is the intent of the passages to say bad things about all Jews, or is that just people's interpretation of reading it?
It depends upon the interpreter. I think in some texts, it really does mean to say bad things about all Jews. And in other texts, it's really quite temporally limited, Jews of a particular generation. But texts are never restricted to what they meant by their author. And more difficult, we actually don't know what the authors intended. The best we can do is make a guess. But anytime you write something, in fact, anytime you say something, people will read or hear something that you did not intend. It's pretty much guaranteed that if somebody listens to this podcast, they're going to come up with some interpretation of what I said that I did not intend at all. Like, oh, she hates Christians. Well, no, I don't. Or she thinks the entire New Testament is terrible. Well, obviously I don't. But people are going to come up with these ideas anyway. So as soon as you say something or you write something, it's out there for people to interpret in whichever way they want. The best we can do as historians is try to determine, given the evidence we've got and other texts in the time period and what we know about lives in the first century, to figure out, well, here's what I think this text meant to say, or better, here's what I think people who were its original audience took away from it. We don't know.
Are there any books of the New Testament that could be part of the Tanakh, or is it pretty clear that none of them would be?
No, none of them is. The Tanakh is entirely in Hebrew, except for a little bit in Aramaic. The New Testament is entirely in Greek. The Tanakh was pretty much already set. I mean, there were some iffy books on the edges, but it was pretty much already set by the time the New Testament gets written. The latest book in the Tanakh is probably the book of Daniel, which dates to the Maccabean period, to the 160s BCE. The New Testament starts getting written down sometime after the year 40 of the Common Era. So it's Greek and it's late compared to the Tanakh.
And I guess in the New Testament, there's you'll know much better than I would, but there's a passage that says no more to be added. Anything else that's added doesn't count. I don't know if I have that right, but in the Tanakh, is there such a passage? Like, how do we know, why did it end, do you think, when it ended? And how do we know that that's it? There was no more.
Yeah. Well, so the last book in the New Testament canon is called the Book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of John. Anybody who calls it Revelations and puts an S on the end doesn't know the title of the book and therefore don't believe them when they tell you the world is about to end. And it puts a curse on anybody who's going to add to or subtract from the book. And because it comes at the end of the New Testament canon, Christians have traditionally read it as saying you can't add anything to the entire New Testament. The Tanakh doesn't actually say that. And by the time we get to rabbinic literature, we find the rabbis are debating the canonicity of some of the books that are now in the Tanakh. So they're debating the canonicity, for example, of Song of Songs, of Ezekiel. It's not clear that Esther was part of the canon of the people who gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, because to date, no fragment of the book of Esther has been found among those scrolls. But it's pretty much set. For the New Testament canon, there was debate going all the way up to the 4th century. So we have some early canonical collections in which there's a text called the Epistle of Barnabas, which is a way anti-Jewish text. So good thing it didn't last. Another text called the Epistle of Clement, which is dreadfully boring in my opinion. The Shepherd of Hermas and others. So in both cases, both the Jewish and Christian community had to figure out what goes in and what comes out and what might be worthy of reading, but we're not going to consider it canonical and so on. So that if you look at the Christian church today, different branches of the Christian church have different books in their scriptures. Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox have Jewish books written in Greek, or at least preserved in Greek, that are not part of the Jewish canon and not part of the Protestant canon. Books like The Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, or the Book of Judith, or Susanna, which is the world's first detective story. And these are what are called, in Protestant terminology, the Old Testament Apocrypha, and in Catholic terminology, the deuterocanonical books. If you look at Christian churches in Ethiopia, you'll find the Book of Enoch as part of the canon. So even when it comes to canon, people are debating. And more than that, people set up canons within canons. So some churches are going to read the Book of Revelation and the Book of Daniel, and they're going to look at apocalyptic stuff. And others are like, no, that's wacko, and we're going to leave that aside, and we're just going to concentrate on, the Gospels and maybe Hosea.
So if you compare the Tanakh versus the New Testament, are there many more different variations in the New Testament, and the Tanakh there's only a few, or is it the same?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what the synagogue did, and the mosque did the same thing, Islam did the same thing, is it insisted on retaining the text in the original, which is why the Quran is proclaimed in the mosque in Arabic, and the Tanakh, whatever text we happen to be reading, is proclaimed in the synagogue in Hebrew. Even though if you live in the United States, for example, you'll get an English translation. If you live in France, you'll get a French translation, or Italy, an Italian translation. But the Hebrew is still preserved. And consequently, you can go into any synagogue in the world, and if you know Hebrew, you'll be able to follow the Torah reading. And in fact, because we have consistent readings on every Sabbath, you'll actually know what the Torah reading is going to be and what the Haftorah reading, the additional reading from the prophets, is going to be. In churches, in certain churches, you're still going to get some of the original. For example, in Greek Orthodoxy, you'll still get the text in Greek. But mostly you get the vernacular. And because there are numerous different translations, you might not hear the same text read, even if you go from, the Protestant church, the Lutheran church here, to the Methodist church here, to the Catholic church here, to the Presbyterian church there. You might get 4 quite different translations. And just to show how complicated that is, the standard translation of liberal Protestant churches in the United States is called the New Revised Standard Version. And that's just come out in a new edition called the NRSV, New Revised Standard Version, UE, Updated Edition. And the Roman Catholic Church in the United States is about to publish a new edition of their English language Bible.
So there seems to be many, many different sects in Christianity, but what about in Judaism? Are they even, I don't know if they're called that. Are there a lot of them, or are there a few?
Yeah, sect is probably not the right word, because sect presumes there's some sort of dominant thing from which some sect split away. Maybe movements might be a better term. So you have, on the liberal side, you have humanistic Judaism, this is sort of atheistic Judaism. You have Reconstructionism, you have conservative, you have the Reform movement, and then you've got modern Orthodoxy, and then you've got various branches of ultra-Orthodoxy with different groups of Hasidim, for example, following different rabbis. And if you're a member of this particular Hasidic group, you might not be in favor of what, the Hasidic group down the block does. So we have substantial distinctions within the Jewish community as well, both in terms of the interpretive tradition and how the worship service is conducted, with the major difference being how much Hebrew do you have versus how much vernacular do you have. Whether women can be ordained, whether people on the LGBTQI plus spectrum can be ordained, how we interpret some of the laws, whether the congregation is expected to keep the dietary regulations or not, and so on. Religions are diverse, and movements themselves are diverse, and it's even the case whether you're in, say, my modern Orthodox synagogue or the local Presbyterian church, that you'll have people sitting in the pews or sitting in the chairs who are thinking, yeah, this is part of my tradition, but I might not agree with it. In the same way that I, as an American citizen, can say, yeah, I'm very proud to be an American citizen, but there are certain things that America does that I'm not real thrilled with. So right. Even within a tradition, you can have self-criticism, and that's also a sign of a healthy movement.
Okay. What about the other, the Kabbalah? I don't know if it's called Kabbalah or Kabbalah. The other Jewish
books
that
where
accompany. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But what other books accompany the Tanakh that you feel are relevant or important to Judaism?
Jews did not stop thinking at the close of the Tanakh. So the major source, in fact, the source that gets us the Judaism that we have today, is not the Tanakh. It's the commentary thereon. So it's the Mishnah and the Talmud. In the same way that Christians will read their Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament, Jews traditionally will read our Tanakh through the lens of rabbinic commentary. And rabbinic commentary, the Talmud, is more important in Judaism overall than the Kabbalah is, because Kabbalistic material is mysticism, and not everybody does mysticism. Not everybody has a mind for it. And the Jewish tradition, to a great extent, pulled back on mysticism because mysticism on the whole is very individual. Mysticism takes you out of your community, and it takes you out of your own world and puts you into something transcendent. And the Jewish people were very much concerned about community and everybody working together. And mysticism cuts into that. So Kabbalah becomes less important than Talmud. And that would even be the case in ultra-Orthodoxy, which does have a strong mystical bent. And we're still writing today, right? Don't think that Jewish sources have ended. The rabbinic response continues up to today.
Oh, wow. So again, going back to you spent a lot of time studying the New Testament. I guess in your own words, like what are some of the ways in which it shaped your thought and belief that you haven't spoken about yet?
Well, it hasn't shaped my belief at all because I'm a historian. Okay. I'm not a theologian. But I do find I find the material attributed to Jesus, good Jewish storyteller, quite ethically provocative. I find his Sermon on the Mount ethically provocative in the same way that I find, say, some of the words of Gandhi. Not all of them. There's certain things I very much disagree with him, or the words of Martin Luther King Jr. provocative, or the Buddha for that matter. But at least Jesus is Jewish, and I kind of resonate with what he's saying coming out of my own Jewish context. I think the parables are very, very good. The New Testament parables are very, very good Jewish short stories that talk more about ethics than they do about theology. I find some of the texts really quite beautiful, and I find some of them dangerous. And then what I want to do is come in and diffuse them, or figuring out some way of keeping them from being deployed in a negative manner. The cool thing about studying this stuff is every time you look at it, you see something new. And that would also be the case if, say, you're a rabbi and you have to preach on the same text every year, because your questions change. Your questions change as you get older, or you encounter new things, or you read something new in the headlines. And then you look at the text and go, gosh, I never noticed that before. And then the next thing you know, you've got a new theory or a new article or a new sermon.
What do you consider the most problematic passages? Maybe we can go over just a couple of them in the New Testament.
Well, there's a list. So, Matthew 27:25, which is the trial of Jesus being held in public with Pontius Pilate as the, judge, jury, and executioner. And Pilate says to the crowd, you can either have this notorious thief named Barabbas, or you can have Jesus. Which one do you want? And the crowd says, kill this Jesus fellow. And Pilate says, why? He hasn't done anything wrong. And the crowd just says, kill him. Starosate, crucify him. And when Pilate found out that he wasn't getting anywhere, but a riot was about to begin, he washes his hands. This is where you get the idea of, washing your hands. And the crowd says, well, listen, we don't care if he hasn't done anything. The quote is, let his blood be on us and on our children. Right? And that's where we get the idea of this perpetual blood guilt of Jews through all the generations. That idea stopped substantially in 1965 with a document called Nostra Aetate, Latin for in our time, which is part of the documents of something called Vatican II. And because the Roman Catholic Church said, no, we can't blame Jews at all times and all places for the death of Jesus, a number of Protestant churches came in and said, yeah, well, that seems like a good idea. But the verse had done an enormous amount of damage. In John chapter 8, Jesus refers to the Jews as children of the devil. You always do your father's desires. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul talks about the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus. The book of Revelation talks about a synagogue of Satan. I mean, there are some very problematic verses in here, but they are diffusable in the same way that there are very problematic verses in the Tanakh, which I do not like. Because you can be self-critical of your own tradition, but they can also be diffused.
Okay. For the Tanakh, I would guess you've learned Hebrew. Have you learned biblical Hebrew? And then have you, you don't just read the English translations, but have you been able to read it in its native language and, in ancient Hebrew or biblical Hebrew?
Well, of course.
Okay.
And I wouldn't be a credible biblical scholar if I couldn't.
Well, so what was that experience like for you that you were able to do that? I would think, very few people spend the time and effort to do that. So how did it change for you? You probably didn't read it the first time, I guess, in, ancient Hebrew, but once you were able to, what was it like for you? Different, how was it different?
Well, I grew up in a synagogue context, so I went to Hebrew school and I learned Hebrew. And unlike most of the kids who went to Hebrew school, I actually paid attention. continued to go after I became bat mitzvah, and then studied Hebrew as an undergraduate, and then studied it even more thoroughly in graduate school. The more you can work in the original language, the more interesting the text becomes. Hebrew is a very condensed language, so and it's based on these three-letter roots for the most part, triconsonantal roots. But depending upon where the word shows up in context, it can have very different types of meaning. And because biblical Hebrew has no vowels, the vowel points don't get put in until the early Middle Ages by a group of rabbis called the Masoretes. Depending upon how you want to point this thing, in other words, what vowels you put in, you can come up with very different readings. And that's something that Rabbinic Judaism glories in. But I think there are a lot of puns in biblical Hebrew because we don't have those vowel points. Greek is a little bit more logical. It's more linear. It has different forms of how verbs take shape and how participles take shape. But Greek also, there's an old Italian proverb that goes pretty much like every translator is a traitor. Because whenever you translate something goes in that doesn't belong there and something comes out that did, because all words have nuances. So reading the text in the original and then saying, do I want to translate this word this way or that way? Do I want to translate this word as faith? The Greek would be pistis. Or do I want to translate it as trust? Those are different words. Do I want to talk about the belief, faith in Jesus or the faith of Jesus? How do I want to run that genitive? And you get very different answers. And sometimes the English goes really wacko, or the English says something that the Greek or the Hebrew does not say. Do I want to translate Isha as woman or as wife? That makes a difference.
So, do you see that the English translations are pretty close and pretty good, or are they wildly off? Like, again, now that you've read it in the native tongue,
yeah, well, it
are you
depends
even more confused, or how do you feel?
It depends upon the translation, and that's why we keep getting new translations, is because people think, this word really doesn't work. And sometimes contemporary concerns will drive different translations. So, for example, the Hebrew word eved and the Greek word doulos means slave. It can also mean servant. Well, there's a big difference between being a servant and being a slave. And when we become more conscious here in the United States of our own history of enforced slavery and its racist legacy, do we want to translate slave or do we want to translate servant? Because there's a lot riding on it. So when it comes to the so-called clobber passages that have been used to harm people on the LGBTQI plus spectrum, do we want to translate words as softy or do we want to translate it as sodomite, which is not an ancient word, by the way? Those make a huge amount of difference also.
Is there any Tanakh text or New Testament text that has all the major interpretations right in there? I mean, it would be a weird way to read it, but
You couldn't. But what a lot of good translations do is they'll give you a translation and then they'll put a little letter, like a tiny little lowercase a or lowercase b next to the word. And you look down below, it says, and this could also mean this. And those are honest Bibles. They say, well, we as editors have chosen to read it this way, but it could also be read that way. Gentle reader, you pick which one you want to read. When I teach, I advise my students, if they can't read the Greek and they can't read the Hebrew, go get a couple of different translations written from people with different theological perspectives. So for the Tanakh, you might want to look at the Jewish Publication Society, but you might want to look at Robert Alter's relatively new translation, which I think is a brilliant translation, or Everett Fox's work. You might want to look at the old Jewish Publication Society version. If you're reading the New Testament, you might want to look at the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, but, also look at the New International Version, which is the kind of popular evangelical, or the New American Bible Revised Edition, which is the Bible on the website of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Compare translations. And then you've got a bunch of paraphrases and you've got MAGA comics and whatever else. So, yeah.
I mean, if Jews understood all you understood, do you think it would shake their faith? And same thing for Christians.
Because faith is not based on academics. I mean, faith is not logical. Faith is not like Sudoku, right? That, as long as you've got a pencil and an eraser and a fairly logical mind, you can all get the right answer. Faith is like love. Faith is not based in the head. It's based in the heart.
I mean, you do have some, engineer types or real analytical types that I'm sure they approach it that way. Not everyone does, but for the people, let's say, that do you think they would just be left confused, or they would not have any faith, or like what? Again, you seem to be pretty disciplined. Like you said, you're a historian, and we're not talking about faith component.
If I could destroy somebody's faith with one lecture, then they're hanging on by their fingernails, and they probably ought not to be hanging on at all. And I'm not interested in doing that. I'm not interested in biblical interpretation that's designed to screw around with somebody's belief system. I'm interested if somebody is a theologically oriented, Christians would say believer, but whatever term we want to use. If somebody's theologically oriented, what I want my biblical studies to do is undergird that theological orientation. Like, you think Jesus is interesting. He's even more interesting than you thought, and I can tell you why. If you have a problem with this text, I might be able to resolve the problem, or in fact make it more complex and therefore more interesting and worth working on. I'm not interested in destroying people's faith. To what end? That would be like destroying somebody's love. I don't want to do that. And I don't think I can, because if I can, then it's not real faith and it's not real love.
Well, it's up to you if you want to answer this. You don't have to, of course, but I mean, has it changed your faith and your belief in studying all of this for so long?
Not particularly, because again, I'm not much on the believer side. I'm more on the history and ethics and literature side. What it has done is made me more ethically aware of the different ways that people read. It's made me, and it's hard for an academic to say this, but it's made me a little bit more humble. It's like I don't have all the right answers, because students in my classes keep coming up with stuff that I haven't considered. It's like I'm blown away by this all the time, which I think is way cool. Great. It's made me aware of both how the text has done a huge amount of damage, but how the text can also be used for healing rather than doing damage. So I spend a lot of time. I ran a gender and sexuality program, founded it and ran it for 12 years at Vanderbilt. And I spent a lot of time dealing with people who had been harmed for various reasons because of the way the biblical text, particularly the New Testament, had been interpreted. And what I was able to do for them is say, here are different ways of reading these passages that have been used to hurt you. Let's look at it this way rather than that way. And that helped them reconcile their own identity with a broader church context. And you do the same thing with Jews.
And then, what was different culturally about people in the time of the Old Testament, which I know spans over 1,000 years, or the Tanakh, versus the New Testament? Like, what do you see as like the major cultural differences, just based on time?
Yeah, well, one major difference, and this depends upon what part of the Tanakh you happen to be looking at, is part of the Tanakh was written while the ancient Israelites had political autonomy. The entire New Testament is written in the context of the Roman Empire, when there is no Jewish political autonomy. How you live your life is determined to a great extent by what the prevailing political system is. Are you being run by people who want to support your identity, or are you being run by people who want to do away with your identity? That makes a huge amount of difference. Are you living in your own country, or are you living in diaspora? The Tanakh was written by Hebrews, Israelites, Jews, for Jews. Although the major figures in the New Testament, Peter, Paul, all the Marys, Jesus, James, they're all Jews. But the New Testament text is primarily focused outward to the Gentile world. So now you have a different audience. So instead of about Jews for Jews, it's about Jews, but not just for Jews, but for a substantially and increasingly Gentile audience. That makes a difference also.
Again, also culturally, just generically, not just for the writers of these texts, but again, just culturally, was the world incredibly different in the 1,000 years before year zero versus the couple hundred years after? Yeah, or was things just moving so slowly that they were mostly the same?
Again, it depends upon the book that you look at. So that if you look at part of the material in Leviticus and the Holiness Code, or some of the material even in Genesis, you're talking about stuff that's probably originally produced in the late Bronze Age or the early Iron Age. So time before they had like plows or iron weapons. As opposed to Roman times when you have massive legions who knew what they were doing with really sharp iron weapons. So agriculture changes, how the military is run changes, how money is run, because back then you didn't have money, you were dealing with barter. So you actually stamped money comes in relatively late given the Bible material. You move from a less traveled to a more traveled world. Ancient Israel, there's not a huge amount of population movement, and then population movement really picks up with the major empires like Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome. So like who your neighbor's going to be?
Yeah, well, this is really interesting. It's really cool.
Yeah, but it also depends upon where you're looking. And part of the problem is we don't know when some of this stuff was written. The best we can do is guess. I mean, Genesis doesn't start out, when in the beginning, the earth was without form and void. And it doesn't say, oh, by the way, I'm writing this in the year 520 in Babylon. So you have to guess on all that stuff.
It sounds like there's bookends though. Like according to all the best guesses or, the evidence they have, what was the span of the Old Testament?
Oh, I think some of the earliest stuff probably goes back to the 9th century or so. And the oral tradition would be even earlier than that, because when a story develops is not necessarily when the story was written down. So writing down probably, 9th century or so, maybe a little bit earlier. King David is usually dated to the 10th century. But then again, we're not sure that there was a King David. I think there was, but I can't prove it.
Do you think that no one was writing for a while and all of a sudden they started writing? Was it a sudden start to the writing? Or?
Right, they're writing. But remember, most people, and that's the difference between then and now, is like most people in antiquity are illiterate. We don't have literacy until we have the public school system. And that's a very modern thing. So yeah, they're telling stories. And the stories, you think of like Homer, right? The Iliad, the Odyssey. A lot of this is being memorized. A lot of it is part of performance, like bards, evil bards, but they had them in professional storytellers going back and forth. And the professional storyteller hones the story. This line works, this line doesn't. It's like comedians going out and trying out the act before they go on late night. So there's earlier stuff, and then it's when does it finally get written down, and then when does it get standardized? Because oral tradition and written tradition go along together for many, many, many years until you finally have a canonical set. And you don't really have a formalized canonical set for Judaism until the Masoretes come in and put the vows in.
Yeah, what was the drive towards canonicalization and why?
Yeah, because it keeps the community united.
Oh, so they realized that at a certain time, all right, we want to keep everyone literally on the same page. We better
literally on the same page. Right.
Yeah.
And so that way you could go from synagogue to synagogue and you'd get the same text and you didn't have to worry about the variants. And if you claim the text to be the divine word, you want it to be as accurate as possible. So standardization is one way of ensuring what at least the people who did the standardizing thought was accurate.
Yeah, why do you think that oral tradition changed and people started writing this stuff down? What do you think prompted that?
It's a good question. There are multiple reasons for that. One, in the first century, you start getting this push toward literacy and toward writing. You start getting, at the end of the Second Temple period, a concern for things like libraries, where people want to collect books, which wasn't such a big deal before that. You get a sense of nations wanting to preserve their own history, and all nations do. So they want to write their history. And then the Jews thought, well, we ought to do ours as well. And the Christians kind of came in late and then picked up this idea of writing from the Jews. You want to, in some cases, preserve both minority and majority opinions because that's a way of keeping the community together. That's what the rabbis are able to do. You want to study your history. And if you just do it by oral tradition, what happens when the old people die? Or what happens if you're taken into exile and nobody remembers? Right. So this was part of the problem that Jews had just before Christianity developed, is because of the work of Alexander the Great in the 4th century, that say the 330s BCE. You started having some population movement. So you got a huge Jewish population in Egypt, in a city called Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great. And these Jews in Egypt can't read Hebrew because they speak Greek like everybody else in Alexandria does. And now what do? Right? So you have to have another text. So they had to translate their text into Greek. And then the Jewish community had to decide, do we keep translating it into the vernacular? Or do we keep the Hebrew? The more the Christian church started using the Greek, the more the synagogue said, okay, let's just shift back to the Hebrew. So some of it is cultural preservation. Some of it is defensiveness. Some of it is organization. Some of it is theology.
What do you think the first writing, I guess they were done on papyrus, or what would the first writings look like?
First writings are cuneiform. They're done on clay tablets. Some of them are chiseled into stone, but your basic writing is done on clay tablets with a stylus, so on wet clay, and then you bake the clay. In Egypt, you've got papyrus, but that's because you can grow papyrus in Egypt. Papyrus doesn't grow it everywhere. Moreover, Egypt is really dry, and for papyrus to last, you need a very dry climate, right? It's not going to work if you're in a place where there's consistent rainfall. Eventually, you start getting writing on parchment. You get some inscriptions on metal. There's a Dead Sea Scroll known as the Copper Scroll because it's actually written on copper. And then eventually you move the scroll form to the book form. That's a technological innovation. And aesthetically, depending upon how you read, you're going to read differently. There's a different aesthetic feel to reading from a scroll to reading from a book. You can't flip pages if you're reading from a scroll. You know? And if that doesn't make any sense, think about the difference between reading a book and reading the same thing on a Kindle.
It's funny. Scrolling is back, but just
scrolling is back in a weird way. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's funny. Yeah, but I mean, it is a different experience. If I go into a church and somebody's reading off a Kindle, I don't quite have the same, or a synagogue, which would never happen. I don't quite have the same, aesthetic feel to it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Huh. It would be weird to have the rabbi or the priest like on an iPad reading the sermon or a PowerPoint presentation instead of reading from a book or a scroll or whatever it may be. It started. So instead of having hymnals or something, you get words broadcast out on a screen with forests and seascapes behind the words. I mean, and it doesn't work for me. When we think about Bibles, we also have to think about what we would call material culture. Who's manufacturing them? If they're done by scribes, who are the scribes? Are they slaves? Are they monks? Are they little children? Are they women? Are they being compensated? Are they looked at as high class or low class? It's the same thing. And then what happens with book printing? Who pays for the printer? Who pays for the type? What's the distribution mechanism? So the Bible is not just a book. The Bible is one of many types of books. And then the whole question is, how do you get the book from the person who wrote it to the person who's going to read it? And that's a whole other issue. Were there any other books or scrolls that were immensely important at this time, or it was only these kind of scrolls that were important?
Oh, no,
they were to compare it to.
Really important. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a really good example of this. So a book called First Enoch, which did not make the canonical cut in the West, but did for some churches in Eastern communions. Hugely important. I mean, it's so important that it gets quoted in the New Testament. It's quoted in a book called the Book of Jude, the Epistle of Jude. The books that were major for the Dead Sea Scrolls, like the Rule of the Community, called 1QS for Cave 1, Q for Qumran, which is the place where it was found, and S for Serach HaYakad, the community rule. Hugely important for the Dead Sea Scroll community, multiple copies, and with different versions of it, but not for anybody else. The works of Josephus on scrolls, the works of Philo, the Jewish philosopher from Alexandria, on scrolls, major stuff. But again, what's important to one person is not important to somebody else. I mean, some people, my husband really cares about how the New York Yankees did or do. Today they won. He's very happy. It's a good day. I don't care. What's important for one person is not for another. One scroll that's central to one group is irrelevant to another group.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do people believe that the Tanakh was just as divinely inspired as the New Testament, or are there different thoughts on what prompted people to write these two different texts?
That would depend upon the person that you asked. Right?
What do you think?
To think of something as divinely inspired means you have to believe in a transcendent God who inspires things. Could be. I don't know, but that's not where my thoughts typically go. That's kind of like the New York Yankees. They're there and they're very important to some people. They're just not quite as important to me. So my concern is less, is this divinely inspired? In fact, I have to give a paper on inspiration next week for the Oxford Forum. When I think of inspiration, I think of what inspires me rather than is this text inspired, right? So I'm inspired by like Serena Williams, who just lost, to go out and do my best despite whatever odds are out there. I'm inspired by my teachers who got me interested in doing biblical studies and convinced me that this was a possibility, right? I'm inspired by my mom, who persevered. I tend not to think about divine inspiration because I take inspiration as really quite something personal. And I guess when it comes to inspiration, I'm inclined to go, I think it was Thomas Edison who said it's something, genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration, right? The stuff that's really inspired comes after lots and lots and lots of work. That inspired violin concerto, boy, that person started practicing at age 3. I'm interested in the work that leads to whatever gets called inspiration.
Well, if I asked, I don't know, a whole collection of rabbis and a whole collection of priests, do you think that they would, for the most part, they would all say, oh, it's divinely inspired, but the Tanakh and the New Testament, or are there tons of different opinions that you see as well out there?
I don't know. You'd have to ask them.
Oh, I just didn't know in the aggregate if you've seen, The New Testament,
it's
a lot
not
more
something
people.
I have lots of friends who are rabbis and lots of friends who are priests, and it's not something I typically talk about with them. I'm more inclined to say, because I don't talk with them about God. Again, I'm not a theologian, so the subject is not particularly interesting to me. I am very interested in how do you interpret this verse?
Yeah, but it would change like you talked about the reasoning why people would write things and the importance of it to them. So if someone felt like, oh, I think that was from God and I was inspired to write this, it would probably give it a lot more weight than just like, I just felt like relaying the story that I heard from my grandmother.
I don't think it's quite that flip. If you see something that you think to be a massive form of injustice, conspicuous consumption and somebody starving right outside that person's gates, you might think, I am inspired to write something here. I am so distressed by what I am seeing that I have to write about it, and I want other people to see this too. I don't think that God has to tell you that what you've just seen is so wrong and that you need to do something about it. But you might nevertheless consider yourself inspired to do it because of what's in your own heart, in your own conscience. And if somebody wants to say that's God moving, I have no problem with that. It's not language that I would use, but I have no problem with somebody else using it. Because again, I'm not interested in taking away anybody's particular theological belief, nor am I particularly interested in having them impose their theological beliefs on me. That's between you and your belief system, or if you prefer, you and your God.
Oh, so all right. So you don't think that again, what prompted people to write this, if it was divine inspiration, you don't think that plays in, or it's very important, or at least you've just decided there's plenty of other stuff to think about.
I have no way of answering the question.
Okay.
Because I wasn't there and I didn't hear God whispering in their ear, I think you should use this word rather than that word.
Right. Yeah.
When people
know your thought.
Right. And when people tell me that they are divinely inspired, well, some of the people who are divinely inspired are the people who, for example, flew their planes into the World Trade Center. The claim of divine inspiration can also go pretty wonky.
That's true.
So again,
like when someone knows about computers, everyone thinks, oh, they know everything about computers, or if someone's a doctor, they know everything about medicine. I guess that's my assumption. Since you've read so much, I figure you know everything about it. So I'll ask.
Oh, no. Somebody says, I know everything about something, they're lying or they're deluded.
No, I mean, I just figured you would have, all these things, you would have thought about or thought through. That's what I'm saying.
No, being a theologian is above my pay grade. You can't prove that God exists. You can't prove that God did not exist. So I'm just perfectly happy to leave it to the individual. If the individual has a belief system, I will work to encourage it. And if the individual doesn't, then I will work to say, well, the Bible, even if you don't believe in God, the Bible has some really, really smart things to say, and some interesting things to say, and some entertaining things to say, and some problematic things to say. And I think it's worth a good read.
Okay. And, just last couple of questions, and I know we got to go very shortly. What are some of the big questions that you're still, or you're looking at right now today? What are you trying to answer for yourself right now?
I'm revising a book that's looking at contemporary issues through a biblical lens. And the point is not to ask, what would Jesus, because I think that's a silly question. Jesus did not live in a participatory democracy with Twitter. But I'm trying to figure out how we talk about, as I mentioned before, the Bible and slavery. Jesus tells a lot of parables about enslaved people and doesn't seem to have a problem with using slavery as a good metaphor, and I do. So I'm trying to figure out what to do with these biblical passages. I just finished up a book on the miracles of Jesus, and I'm extracting from some of that to do a chapter on Jesus and healthcare, to look at some of the disabilities that the Bible flags, and then the question of how they are healed and what the community response is, and how we bring those stories into the present so that they can actually have some meaning rather than just thinking, well, good for that person, but what about, my mother who's dying? I'm looking at questions of Jesus in economics and what is economic justice? What would it look like? Jesus says things to like this rich guy. He says, sell all you have and give to the poor and come follow me. Well, I don't think that's terribly practical, except for some people it might work, like monks and nuns. But what do you do if you've got a family? So how do we take some of those really edgy biblical passages that are attributed to Jesus or told about him and say, what can we learn from these passages that might help us think our way through some of contemporary issues where we're having cultural battles rather than some sort of cultural sane discussion? So I'm asking big questions, and I'm using the biblical material, primarily the gospel material, but you can't do the gospel material unless you do the earlier stuff first, because Jesus comes out of a Jewish background. So you got to know what the background is to help us think our way through in a smart way rather than a goofy way or a let's play first century Bible land way. And just to be intelligent about it.
So last question, if the Tanakh was written today or rewritten today, or the New Testament was rewritten today based on our times, like how different would it look? What do you think would be like the main differences?
Yeah, it would be in English and you could download it from the internet. You know, their concerns are not our concerns. And I'm really not, what you're asking is actually a question of alternative history. It's sort of like saying, you know, what if the Nazis had won World War II, or, you know, what if the Russians had gotten to the moon first, or whatever. And I'm not a big fan of alternative history. Doing the real history is hard enough. When people talk about alternative facts, and doing ancient history is really hard because we don't have anybody here who's left from that time period. The best we can do is put it together with the sources that we have, whether, you know, material culture, archaeology, text. So, you know, like, I don't know, but I do think we have contemporary prophets. I'm not sure if they're divinely inspired, but I think they say wise things that are worth paying attention to. Greta Thunberg, who's concerned about climate change, for example, or people who are interested in, you know, cutting down what it costs to go to school. People interested in alternative forms of energy. You know, I think maybe if we had a scripture today, those would be some of the questions we'd be asking. And okay. I would hope that if we had a scripture today, we could be a little bit more humble about saying that there may be multiple answers to the same question, and there may be multiple ways of understanding divinity, because today we are much more aware of diverse religious expressions, whether Islam, which did not exist at the time the Tanakh was written and did not exist at the time the New Testament was written, or Hindu tradition or Buddhist tradition, the various forms that Christianity has taken, and so on. Scripture in a sense is always being written. If you read something and you take away from it I never thought about that, but now that I am thinking about it, I think I need to change the way I live. Well, that call an inspired text. I never thought about this before, but now that I've been to my doctor, I realize that my cholesterol count is really high and I need to change my diet. And maybe I ought to think about where the food is being sourced. Okay. That sort of change of lifestyle, for whatever reason, that could be prophetic, could change your life. And if you change your life, who knows? You could change the lives of the people around you. Who knows? See,
that's a very nice ending to the interview. That's awesome. I like what you just said.
Happy to talk with you.
Well, thank you for coming. Where can people find out more about your, you know, all your work and take a look at it if they want to check it out?
Well, the easiest way to find what I do is to go onto Amazon and look me up. You will find lots and lots of stuff. And if people want to study with me, so my job at Hartford requires that I be on site in June in Connecticut. And you can take a course with me, one intensive in June, either on site or by Zoom. It's a synchronous class. So you can Zoom into my class Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday from 9 to 12 Eastern time. And you can take the course for credit, or you can take it as an audit, which I believe is cheaper. So if people want to study with me, they can actually do that as well.
Okay, excellent. Well, AJ, thanks so much for coming and talking over all these issues. It was a good call.
My pleasure. Happy to talk with you. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.